We're going to learn that it wasn't until 1947 that our Supreme Court began to change the meaning of the First Amendment. And then it was only in 1962 that they completely reversed what our Founding Fathers had originally intended. Listen.
The next time Jefferson's letter appears in U.S. Supreme Court is in 1947 in a case called Everson versus Board of Education. And in that particular case in 1947, the Supreme Court said very simply, the First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. Now, in that decision, the first time in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court, the court quoted only 8 words from Jefferson's letter. They didn't give the context, they didn't give the full meaning, they didn't even give the fact that for 3 decades they had used that letter to keep Christian principles in public affairs. In this case, challenged a Christian principle in public schools. There was funding going on for Christian activities in public schools. And the court in 1947 said, now the First Amendment's given us a wall here, very strict, we must adhere to it. But even then, in 1947, the court said, but that doesn't mean we have to take Christian principles out of school. So the Supreme Court, even though they used Jefferson's letter, allowed Christian principles to remain in schools. Now, in the next 15 years, something unusual happened with that phrase of Jefferson. It appeared in case after case after case after case. The Supreme Court talked about that phrase every opportunity they had. One would think that they were following the policy laid out by Dr. William James. It was Dr. James who had explained that there's nothing so absurd that if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. And for the next 15 years, all we heard from the court was separation from church and state. They would say the Founding Fathers wanted separation from church and state, but they wouldn't give you any Founding Fathers. They wouldn't make any quotes. They would just give you this umbrella that this is what the Founding Fathers wanted. They talked about it so much that in one case, in 1958, called Bear versus Colmorgan, one of the judges had had it with hearing separation. He wrote a stinging dissent. He said, if this court doesn't stop talking about separation, he said, somebody's going to start thinking it's part of the Constitution. He said, enough's enough. Let's quit this. That was in 1958. Well, the court continued to talk, and it was in 1962, in a case called Engel versus Vitale, the first time that the court ever actually applied the misuse of the phrase separation church and state. They said, under separation church and state, we can't have prayer in schools anymore. That was a practice that had gone on for 320 years, but they had so distorted the meaning that by 1962 they reapplied it. And so that's the evolution of the First Amendment. That's how we've come from where the Founding Fathers wanted us to where we are today, to where that now separation church and state means you keep all religious practices out of public affairs. That's completely contrary to the intent of the Founding Fathers.